Hello, we have with us Professor Stephen Muecke from Australia. Professor Stephen Muecke is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities, Emeritus Professor at the University of New South Wales, and Adjunct Professor in the Nulungu Research Institute of the University of Notre, Australia. He is a cultural theorist and has worked at the University of Technology, Sydney, University of Western Australia, University of Adelaide, and Flinders University. He has collaborated for many years with the Gularabulu people of the Kimberley region in Western Australia. An early result of that collaborative work was the book Reading the Country, Introduction to Nomadology, published in 1984, co-authored with Krim Benterak and Paddy Rowe, which explored the meaning and politics of place through Aboriginal narratives, songs, and paintings. More recently, again with Paddy Rowe, he published the Children's Country, Creation of a Gularabulu Future in Northwest Australia. He's also a creative writer, and one work is The Mother's Day Protest and Other Fictocritical Essays, published in 2016, and has translated several books from French into English, of which one notable one is Another Science is Possible by Belgian philosopher Isabelle Stengers, and The Wandering Souls by French ethno-psychiatrist Toby Nathan. His other works are Culture and Waste, The Creation and Restriction of Value, co-edited with Gay Hawkins in 2003, John in the Andamans and Other Fictocritical Stories in 2008, Lathor and the Humanities, co-edited with Rita Felsky and published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2020. The other books are Cultures of Trade, written with Devalina Ghosh, and it's a cultural studies research on the Indian Ocean from 2000. Our Grateful Dead Stories of Those Left Behind, and it's a translation of a work by Vincent Desperate. And Professor Stephen Muecke is one of the 6 scholars in residence of this university during this season, that is 2022-23, and the first ever scholar in residence of the Department of English, Sri Shankaracharya University. Let me thank both Sri Shankaracharya University and the Kerala Higher Education Council, which made this interaction possible. Welcome to Shankaracharya University. So let's have the conversation with your own country, Australia. So will you be able to say something about Australia, Australian life, its history of colonialism? And as everyone knows, Australia is a post-colonial country as well. So will you be able to explain a little bit about all these things that are there in Australia?
Yes, thank you, Professor Rajan. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. About Australia's history of colonisation, of course, the subcontinent of India and Australia are both part of the old British Empire. And while you've become independent in 1947, Australia still has the new king as head of state. Our colonisation starts in 1789, at which point Aboriginal people talked about the invaders who arrived. So my work has often been focusing on recovering some of the Aboriginal history and also the stories that Aboriginal people tell, oral stories, putting them into print, and participating in what could be called a cultural and political renaissance of Aboriginal Australia. But of course, being a white person, this is not really my duty or responsibility. When I started my work as a young man, it was only white people studying Aboriginal people. But today there are so many younger Aboriginal scholars that I'm happy to say that I'm now redundant.
Okay, all right. So we had this British Queen, the death of British Queen on 8th of September, and we had a lot of grieving from around the world, and from the Commonwealth of Nations, there were different kinds of responses. For example, the Barbados said it was becoming a republic. It wanted to have nothing to do with the Queen or British monarchy. And now, you being an Australian, and Australia has this monarch again, and of course it's Charles III. And what is the kind of response that response that we had from Australia in the wake of Queen's death in relation to monarchy and things like that?
Well, immediately, apart from hours and hours of watching the funeral on television, Australians immediately revived the idea of becoming a republic. So this became once again a topic of discussion. It's been raised before. We've had a referendum before that failed. The previous government, a Conservative one, would not be interested in becoming a republic. But for the last few months we have had a new government, slightly more progressive, the Labor government, and republicanism is on the agenda for them, but not immediately. Because they're a new government, they're going cautiously, and they'll probably put that item to the Australian people as a referendum if they get a second term of government, another 3 years. I'd imagine that's when that sort of thing might happen.
Okay. So you have travelled quite a lot in India. Probably you might have come to India several times, and over the years, maybe for the last 20 years or so. So in India we had this economic liberalization in 1991, and so what is the kind of transformation that you could see in India, and what is the kind of impression that you carry about India when you go back?
Getting to know India has proved to be not something one can do in one lifetime even. And over a few years I've become aware of just how rich and interesting Indian history is and how complex the place is culturally. Such an ancient and rich tradition with many different ethnicities and religions. The changes I've noted probably concern, for instance, the embrace of new technologies, new media technologies especially, the transformation of cities like Bangalore into IT capitals of the world, the way that India has leapfrogged into the digital age without necessarily having to pause over the previous technologies. It's adopting new technologies very rapidly. The relationship between Australia and India has probably improved. One of our big export industries is in fact the education of foreign students, and the largest body of international students in Australia are from the subcontinent. So there is a strong relationship there that is evident today, and so that's. As for other changes, I would. It's just fascinating to watch the. I mentioned the new media technologies and digital humanities type work in universities, but this goes hand in hand with the ancient traditions. It's something that's remarkable about India is not letting go of ancient traditions. Australia is very different because of the European history being only 230 years old. Our ancient traditions are all necessarily indigenous Australian ones.
Okay. And I know this is your first visit to Kerala, so and in one of your books you say the pleasure of anticipation is something maybe I don't know whether it would be consummated or not. Has it consummated in your present travel to Kerala?
Kerala is a beautiful state in India, and I was very pleased to accept the invitation. Perhaps I wouldn't have accepted an invitation to one of the big metropolises like Delhi because of the choking pollution. As interesting as Delhi is as a place, yesterday in Kerala you and I went for a walk and we saw a rainbow. I don't think you see them in the big cities. So environmentally clean, beautiful landscape with the ocean and the mountains not so far apart from each other. So yeah, very interesting place.
Okay, so we have this east-west divide. Immediately Kipling and people like that would come to your mind. And if you are asked to compare the East and the West, probably India and Australia, or India and a developed nation, a kind of cultural analysis, what would be your response?
I would refuse the kind of transition narrative that is often taken for granted, that Europe and North America are leading the way and the rest of the world is catching up. The notion of a permanent lag that that kind of modernisation story imposes on the rest of the world. So if you refuse that kind of story, then you have to accept the notion of alternative modernities and parallel. Huge countries like China and India are not going to be very happy about being called backward in any way, especially today. So the dominance of the West has been severely reduced, I think, with the rise of big countries like China and India. And Western ideas are no longer universal or potentially universal. They have, to quote Dipesh Chakrabarty, the historian, been rather provincialised, put in their place.
Okay, all right. So you have, I think Indian migrants are a very considerable population in Australia. I don't want to be nationalist here, but let me ask you a question. How are they doing in Australia?
Yes, so generally I think doing very well. They're often professionals. It's not like we have a kind of subaltern or labour force that is coming from India at all. Migration depends upon being relatively wealthy. It's middle class Indians who migrate largely, and they're doctors and all sorts of professions. So they're doing fine. And the other major group is, of course, the students who are doing undergraduate or postgraduate work. They, in past years, there have been problems because of accommodation issues and some racist reactions on the Australian streets, or I'm not sure how these things started up, but there are some racists in Australia, and they haven't always behaved themselves. That issue has, which was, I don't know, only 10 years ago or less. I haven't heard any more stories of that nature since then. So for some reason that issue has disappeared. And of course with the COVID episode, the arrival of overseas students stopped in any case. So they're the two major groups we have, and their contribution to Australia has been one of the contributions to what we celebrate as Australian multiculturalism, and that involves festivals like Diwali and Indian food and the participation of Indians in Australian life is both as a community and with the broader community, side by side with Chinese Australians, Pacific Islander Australians, and Australians from the Middle East and Europe. So it's a melting pot.
Okay. So, Professor Muecke, you have been in education for the last so many decades, probably 30 or 40 decades. So, let's talk a little bit about education. So, if you're asked a question about Australian education and what is good about Australian education, and if there's something bad you want to improve, see improved upon, what is that as well?
Yes, so what's good about it is first of all, it is quite handy to be that it's English medium for our international connections. English has become more and more dominant in the world as a medium of education. Today, as an Australian, I can go to a European conference and often, for convenience, the language will be in English, with French, German, whatever people there speaking English. So that's, luckily for Australia, we're not a minority language. So that's one advantage that Australian students have. They also have a relatively well-funded education system at all levels, from junior right through to university, and a very robust postgraduate research culture, reasonably well-funded scientific institutions and other bodies. So on the whole, it's doing fine, but there are things to complain about. You asked about the good and the bad, and we have, with the past government, the Conservative government that was in power for 10 years, there was an attack on the humanities and social sciences, efforts to defund that kind of research, sometimes even research projects that were approved for funding were vetoed by government ministers because they had something to do with issues like climate change. So the previous government was in denial about climate change and made it very difficult for us to be progressive on this crucial issue facing the planet. So in those terms, we've had certain problems in relation to the funding of the humanities, which I hope the new government will reverse. The humanities is not liked because it produces critique. The older government was frightened of intelligent people criticising them, and so they thought, these people won't vote for us anyway, we will just defund their institutions as much as we can. And this is done with a chorus of support from conservative media, which includes often run by Rupert Murdoch. His newspapers or his TV stations are notoriously conservative and in denial about problems like climate change.
Okay. In fact, I wanted to ask you about the role of humanities, but you have already fairly answered that question, preempted that question, and we have this crisis in humanities. We always talk about. Then we have this hyper-capitalist world. So, what is the role of what is the role that universities can play in a situation of Anthropocene? You have neoliberal policies, and we have very increasingly hyper-capitalist sort of world. So, what's the role of universities in such a world? And what are the kind of challenges that universities face in such a situation?
I mentioned before Australian multiculturalism, and we talked before about the various diasporic cultures that have settled in Australia, including Indians and also Greeks and Lebanese and Chinese. But one of the things that should be done more, even though I spoke about the convenience of having English as a common language, the teaching of the language of those communities should be taken up again, I think, just for the sake of the richness of our kind of civilization. Being monolingual is not particularly smart in a global world. It's diplomatic to be able to arrive in another country and be able to speak their language. Our foreign minister is of Chinese Australian origin, so she can go to China and speak Mandarin, which is a huge advantage. So I think those sorts of things have been neglected and should be revived. But and maybe they also have an effect in what you call the neoliberal context of it's kind of runaway capitalism at the moment. Being a country that is civilized by way of having knowledge of other languages and other cultures enables greater diplomacy, enables us to claim greater cosmopolitanism, as opposed to being a monolingual English-speaking large island, but small in number of population in the bottom of the Pacific. So our role there could be, as Australia's role, could be more significant on the world stage, were it to be more statesmanlike in a cosmopolitan way, I think.
Stephen, and now your research is basically on, or primarily on environmental humanities. So, will you be able to talk briefly about environmental humanities, its birth, and Australia has a great role in it? We have this Australian Journal of Environmental Humanities, which was begun in 2012. So the birth and growth of the discipline or subdiscipline, that is environmental humanities.
Yes, I'm excited about the development of this relatively new field, though of course it has some classical texts going back into the middle of the 20th century, like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring or Aldo Leopold's work. There are these classical roots, but as a discipline, it has taken off in the last 10 years, with that journal publishing some very good stuff. So it's from my point of view, I used to be in cultural studies, more broadly in cultural studies, and for me, environmental humanities was a departure, but also bringing some of the same methods, interdisciplinary methods, that cultural studies was offering. So you could say it's kind of like cultural studies, except it brings environmental issues into the analysis, and it can do so with fieldwork, and it works with issues to do with the environment that are not usually carried out by scientists. Moral issues, political issues, historical issues, all of these things can be talked about in relation to the kinds of problems that we are faced in our daily lives, and that more dramatically the whole planet seems to be facing with climate change, global warming, and related issues like the COVID outbreak, which is not disconnected from climate change issues.
All right. So, I know that definition is always a problem, but if you are asked to define environmental humanities, how would you attempt to do that?
Yes, so while there are various kinds of studies that can be done under that heading within the discipline, it's basically an analysis that mobilizes the tools of the humanities and tries to do so in collaboration with scientists. So, for instance, somebody working on the behaviour of a particular animal, like the koala bear in Australia, environmental humanities asks for a place on a team that would be studying the koala bear, while the scientists are providing the factual data. The environmental humanist is trying to link their story with the broader stories that the public understands about that role of the animal, the role of that animal in the life of Australians. So it's it embraces multiple worlds, if you like, the worlds of humans, the worlds of animals, and the worlds of things. So very long definition there.
Okay, all right. So we have this ecological crisis now. So we very often talk about Anthropocene, and most probably all the disciplines have this environment and nature and Anthropocene as a primary domain of concern. So what do you think has caused or is the primary cause of this kind of an ecological problem that humanity is facing right now?
The Anthropocene, where humans are now responsible for creating their own geological age, the cause of that is the end result of not just the Industrial Revolution, but its acceleration on a global scale. So the consumption of fossil fuel-based energy has gone unchecked. And while we've known for a very long time that this is a dangerous thing to do, it's been very hard to put the brakes on that kind of on the use of that particular kind of energy, because of the benefits it's brought in terms of bringing a better quality of life to huge numbers of people, and the promise of a better quality of life to even more people. As that has been happening, we have not been factoring in what it has cost in terms of environmental degradation. So we've made ourselves richer and more comfortable, but there's a price to be paid, and we're starting to realise that the bill is being delivered now. We have to start to calculate those costs.
All right. What is the kind of future that you visualize for environmental humanities?
It will look after itself. When I look at the projects in universities that many younger people are doing, all sorts of projects in the environmental humanities, from philosophical ones through to historical, through to the kinds of collaborative work I was talking about before in relation to the extinctions of certain animals, the ethical issues involved with the attempts to bring back forms of life with genome reconstruction. So all of those things are happening at a great pace, and I think that, coupled with the political concerns that the new generations have, will ensure that environmental humanities work increases in its pace and numbers of people working in it, not at the expense of environmental science. I think they'll work in parallel.
Okay, we have this idea of post-human. We talk of post-humanism, post-humanities, and in fact I myself have conducted a seminar a year or so before on post-humanities and the pandemic, COVID-19. So you have this idea of post-humanities, which is very fashionable, at least in the subcontinent. So will you be able to relate this idea of post-humanities and the post-human to environmental humanities? And this idea is something that has generated some amount of hostility as well because of its technophilia, transhumanism, and things related to that.
Yes, so under the heading of post-humanities, there's a lot going on. It too is relatively new, and I think at the one end of the spectrum we have environmental humanities type work, and at the other end the more technologically related robotics, artificial intelligence, transhumanism, the kind of technological optimism that imagines that humans will evolve into kind of bionic species in some later date. That robotics side doesn't interest me so much, but I'm more interested in what is happening with posthumanism in the more in relation to multi-species relationships. What are human relationships with non-humans? The decentering of human exceptionalism or human mastery over the world, and so stronger collaborations, entanglements of humans with non-humans is what we often talk about in the post-humanities at that end of the spectrum. But all of the post-humanities, I think, questions what it is to be human. We're leaving behind the philosophical concept of humanism or liberal humanism that was current through the 20th century. What it means to be human is now a question of what it means to relate to other forms of life, I think. And we don't talk, I think, about, with the post-humanities, we don't talk so much about human nature anymore, because I think we accept that whatever it is to be human is a work in progress.
So we have this book, Notre and the Humanities, which was published in 2020, and it takes a different approach to humanities. So will you be able to comment something on that book and its kind of approach? And you have a lot of very important scholars writing in that anthology.
Yes, so Bruno Latour has, of course, he's sadly died only last week, but very, very, very well known as a philosopher and social scientist. But he's also somebody who's bridged the humanities sciences divide. He's often working with scientists, and he's often bringing a humanities perspective to the work he's carrying out with them. So the project that Rita Felsky and I got going was, let's try to inject something into the humanities. People talk about the decline of the humanities quite often. And Bruno Latour had made a huge impact with an essay called Why Has Critique Run Out of Steam? And this mobilized a lot of debate, and it was about perhaps the decline of the humanities has got something to do with the negativity of critique. So what are some more positive ways of talking about the role of the arts, of literature in the world, without making out that we as humanities folk can express critical judgment all the time on these other things, but rather talk about our more intimate relations with art and literature and so on. So that was our project with Latour and the Humanities, and it also came with a method, which was actor network theory. So this is a kind of method of analysis that can be put to use in history, but also in literary criticism. So a literary critical analysis of a novel or any work of art really that uses actor network theory will start asking questions about what kind of actors are involved in the literary work of art. How are they working together? How are readers also implicated in the support of those actors that are appearing in the literary work of art. So there is a kind of network of devotion that supports the literary work of art and keeps it alive in the world. Why is Shakespeare still alive? Because there is this huge network of Shakespeare scholars, students being taught it in schools, a love of Shakespeare, this is a positive aspect, that ensures its survival. And let me give you one quick example of a Latourian approach to the literary work of art, and that could be called the mode of existence of the fictional character. So we know that fictional characters exist. We know that Hamlet exists from Shakespeare. Mickey Mouse exists from Disney. They all exist, but in what way do they exist? Because they don't exist like you and I exist. In a way, they, because of this network of devotion, they have become immortal figures. Even if all of the works of Shakespeare are eliminated from the world, there will still persist somehow a memory of Hamlet and his moral issues that makes that kind of subject a fictional subject who is nonetheless has a right to exist, but in a different kind of way from the way that historical figures exist or the way that you and I exist today. So that's just one example of respecting the different kinds of ontologies, ways of being that literary works of art can sustain.
Okay, so yet another work is Our Grateful Dead, your translation of the Belgian philosopher Vincent Desprez's book, and I think it's a very interesting book. So it's about, and the title itself is a little bit of a ironical one, and I think it's, as you have said, it's taken from the name of a rock band, and it's, I think, about the need for exchange between the living and the dead. So this has some connection with, of course we can connect it to an Indian situation where we have this elaborate kind of rituals for the dead. So will you be able to explain it a little bit more?
Yes, so the title of Vincent's book, or the full title is, in English, is Our Grateful Dead, Stories of Those Left Behind. And it comes out of her own experience of her father dying and stories in her family about people who died. And so she thought she would explore this in a kind of narrative way through stories and ask people to tell her stories about their loved ones and how they relate to their loved ones. And like I was saying before about the mode of existence of fictional beings, she's looking at the mode of existence of humans as they continue to exist after their death. So while our bodies disappear and our full existence is much reduced, we still continue to exist in the memories and rituals of those who are left behind. It's a sign of human culture since the beginning of time that we have this kind of respect and care for the dead. It's a remarkably irrational thing to do, really, because while we claim to have this continued connection with the dead, we can't really have that connection, but somehow we need to keep them alive. So she's got some great stories in the book from anthropology, from daily life, as I said, from her own family, from post-Vietnam War, where the Vietnamese talk about the American soldiers who might continue to be there in the form of ghosts. So it's not a question of whether we believe in ghosts or anything like that. It's a question of the stories that won't disappear. No matter how much you tell people, don't believe in ghosts or I don't believe in ghosts, the stories still persist through our cultures in all sorts of different ways from culture to culture. So her book is a valuable text for cultural studies, for anthropology. It also helps people, I think, in their bereavement, in their mourning for the loss of loved ones, because it's a way of, it's got a kind of ethics which says you don't have to go through, as some American psychologist became famous for saying, the stages of grieving or the work of mourning, as if you go through these 5, 6, 7 stages and at the end you are resolved, closure. She says you don't have to do that. You can continue to live with your dead as if they were alive, and see that as a positive experience, not something to have closure about.
Okay, thank you, Professor Stephen Muecke, for coming over here and sharing your ideas, talking about your books, and of course enjoying Kerala. Thank you so much.
It was a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.